Welcome to In the Shadows, a podcast where we explore scholarship and discuss invisible student populations in higher education. We are your hosts, Yazmin, Aaron, and Kate, higher education and student affairs professionals in California. We are also graduate students in the Higher Education Administration and Leadership program at Fresno State. Join us in this episode as we shine light on students in the shadows.
Welcome back, everybody, to our last and final episode of this series in our podcast called In the Shadows. My name is Yazmin. I would like to welcome one last time my co-host. Please introduce your lovely selves.
I'm Aaron. And I'm Kate.
And the purpose of really this episode today is to recap our past three podcasts and our student populations and have a conversation among the three of us of what did we feel we accomplished in producing this podcast, what we learned, and what were some of our key takeaways of producing this podcast. And so to remind our audience members, we talked about three very invisible student populations, which are student parents, formerly incarcerated students, as well as students with disabilities. And really engaged in research in each of these. We had Brandy come on to one of our episodes when we talked about student parents, as her thesis work was revolving around student parents, and we learned a lot from her and her work in conversating with student parents and institutional agents, and even doing a deep dive in the kind of websites and information that was out there for student parents on the particular campus that she was looking at. We also were able to have our co-host Erin really talk about her experiences she identified with the student population of students with disabilities and what that process was for her. And when we talked about formerly incarcerated students, we did a deep dive on what barriers they have, but also how inspirational the students are when they're able to have that opportunity to join programs like Project Rebound and Rising Scholars, really help students in CSUs and community colleges and other similar programs within the UC system, and how there's a way for these students to join these programs and gain the resources and mentorships they really need to be able to become successful and continue giving back to their community. And I would like now to have my co-host kind of join in the conversation and talk about what did we all learn about these student populations and what we feel like we accomplished about having these conversations and even producing a podcast.
I'd say for me, this is Erin, by the way. I think working on this podcast and working at invisible populations was incredibly enlightening because they are invisible. They're not populations we normally can see or talk about. They can be part of other marginalized communities as well, having multiple identities. So I think it was really important to be able to focus on student populations that maybe the typical higher education or student affairs professional may not have as much knowledge about because it's not talked about as much. I also really enjoyed kind of the research dive into everyone. For those of you who don't know, we each took a population. That's why we would moderate it, and did the research and shared it with our colleagues. And it was a great way to learn how to create annotated bibliographies and share that research information with our colleagues who may not have time to read all the individual articles. So that was really neat. What about you, Kate?
Yeah, it was oddly fun to do research. I know when we kind of think of research, it's not like at the top of our list of things that we enjoy doing. But I think our research really had a good reasoning behind it. Learning about these student populations that some of us may or may not necessarily belong to, but also it's also understanding that the research that we do provide and all of our resources that we used are going to be on our website. um, it's not everything out there. And so I think it also encourages us to really go out and take the initiative to learn even more. Um, but I think when producing the podcast too, it's actually been really fun. Like this whole experience of being able to talk about experiences and what we've learned and being able to share that as we're kind of mini experts, I would say, within our realm of the podcast, I think has actually been really enjoyable to kind of teach each other about these groups. And I think it's also really pushed forth the need to understand the student experiences. I think with all of our episodes that we've done, we've heard from Brandy, who was able to share some of her stories that she heard from the students who participated in her study. Erin, you're pretty much a first account of students with disabilities. And Yazmin, when all three of us had a chance to listen to the panel for formerly incarcerated students, I think it really emphasizes the importance of listening to our students and hearing from them what they're actually experiencing. Because we can say, oh, we're missing this, but we're not the ones who are trying to get the services that are so desperately needed.
Yeah, and I think also like by listening to students, right, and their needs, it makes us better advocates and say, hey, I've heard from first accounts, from research, from student panels on ways that the institution and institutional agents can provide resources that are needed by these students to be successful, to be able to navigate such a bureaucratic system that is higher education. And I also want to mention how Erin, when we did your episode, and you really emphasized on including students with disabilities in diversity statements and inclusion and those conversations that we also have to talk about students who have invisible identities. And I think it fits so well with all of the three student populations that we talked about, because they are not based on the quote unquote traditional like students, whether that's like the 18 to 24, or for the fact that institutions weren't meant for anyone other than white cisgendered men. And so it's really interesting for me, that was one of my takeaways, was that we really have to move beyond just racial and ethnic diversity ideology when talking about equity and inclusion, and really understanding that students hold and can hold multiple identities and how they intersect with one another. That was something that I really took away.
I think, Yasmin, you bring up, I think, one of the most important things to consider when we talk about our student populations, and really kind of focusing on the ones that we did in our podcast. But I think too, one of the takeaways for me is it shows that there is much more work that needs to be done on an institutional level. To be completely transparent, I really only have the background knowledge of the institution that I've, graduated from and work at. But I think it also provides reasoning for any of the other institutions, whether it's in California, on the other side of the United States, really understanding that the institutions is also tasked with looking at and understanding how to support these students as well, and looking at what barriers they may not have realized are barriers, I guess, and addressing them. Because then I think that's when we truly start to approach, or at least start building the foundation of equity that I think a lot of us are striving for. Not just being able to provide a higher education for everyone, but making sure anybody who comes into the institution is going to be able to find the help that they need. And if we're treating everyone equally, that's almost doing them a disservice. So for me personally, I think that was one of my big key takeaways from learning about these populations and really looking at, their experiences and how that's translating to what we're seeing at our institutions.
I kind of wanted to comment on what Yazmin was saying about all of the student populations we spoke about are part of what diversity means. And in kind of popular culture or even higher ed, depending, diversity is used a lot and it's almost like a buzzword. And it means at its core, heterogeneous populations, different populations, as opposed to homogenous. And I think a good thing that Kate and Yazmin pointed out is that so many people have so many different identities that they may have one of the dominant identities, but they may have another marginalized identity. So we don't always know that person's story. So I go back to what Kate and Yazmin say about listening to students. It can be really overwhelming when we're super busy, when we're meeting with students and we have appointments and we're like, oh, I just don't have time for this. But sometimes you might be the only one listening. And so you can really make a difference for that individual student because no one else may be listening. And so I hope that is something that we can take away for all populations and all students, of course. Um, but I know when we think about change, a lot of times we think of it at the macro level and making big change, but you making a change for that one student is 100% for them. So I think that's a good thing to remember when we get discouraged. Another thing I want to say that I learned is there's a lot of really great programs out there that people don't know about. And I guess the challenge that we have is finding a way to make sure that students do know about it, that students are targeted so that they can know about these really wonderful programs that can offer them support. Because I think one of the hardest things is we have students struggling who could benefit from these, but they have no idea that they exist. That's something I talk to students a lot every day, where I'll be like, well, have you, thought about going to, like, if I talk to an undocumented student, I'm like, well, have you thought about going to the Dream Success Center? I didn't even know that was a thing. And it's not because they aren't doing great work there. They are, but everyone is limited in how they can do outreach. So finding a way to find some institutional plan that we can let people know about these students.
Yeah, and I think it's true. There's so much programming out there that is so beneficial to all these students, and it's a lot of them, and we've heard it from even Brandy. It's word of mouth. It's as you mentioned, like other staff members knowing about a program, or when we listened into the student panel, students also said that they learned about the program through word of mouth because the program went out into the community to learn about that higher education was an option for them. And so it's important to create more visibility on the programs that are created. And I think also from the conversation that we had with Brandy too is in her findings how it's important that we have data on students and collect data, and not only collect data, but I think Erin, you might have said this, is not only collect data but actually use the data. And how do we do that, right? How do we from whatever level we are in the student affairs profession, whether we're entry level position, whether we're in a mid-level position, or we're a director, like we all have a sense of, I think, a way to affect change. And even if it's small ways, right, like Erin mentioned, like having a conversation and listening to a student, that's huge. But how do we like encourage leadership in collecting that data and using that data? Because as Brandy mentioned, like we need buy-in from leadership to provide more services and programs, because sometimes these programs are funded by temporary funds that will eventually not be there, and that greatly affects students. There's so many great programs, but how do we continue funding those programs if they are on temporary funding? And how do we ensure that we can collect data and use it? I think was something that I also took away, especially from the conversations and the research that Brandy did, because those were some of her results that she got from her study.
I will say, I think one thing that I think the three of us can collectively agree on about one of our accomplishments of this podcast is beginning down the road of allyship. I think with a lot of our student populations, whether they're in the shadows or not, we have to stress the importance of what allyship is. And even though we may not identify with that student group, we can still advocate for their needs, or just to make sure that, you know, they're doing all they can to achieve their, college education. But what can we do to, I think, kind of, Yasmin, as you said, increase that buy-in? If you have more advocates that are showing you, no, these students need the help, and here's what we can be doing, I think we make a better case and get that buy-in from administration. And so I think, I would hope that one of the accomplishments that we've done, and I hope our listeners can agree to, if at least a little bit, is that we've kind of shed light on how we can start being allies for these students. And maybe it inspires some of our listeners to go out and read more. And I think that is a great opportunity. And I think even then, our work has done something.
I am with you on that, Kate. I would like to challenge all three of us, as well as our listeners, especially if they're not in, you know, positions of power or even like faculty, that you can be a scholarship practitioner. And if you're interested in something and you don't see it talked about a lot, maybe you can do some kind of research study. Maybe you can collaborate with faculty. Maybe you can do your own thing. Because Brandy is right. We need the data. If we don't show the hard numbers, it's really hard to get people to buy in, because unfortunately there are limited funds, and numbers show, or even stories, if you can find a way to make stories compelling and it's similar themes, it is a way of showing our administrators, our leaders, our policymakers that this is something that's truly needed and that it will benefit society to have this funded. So I think one thing to keep in mind is we really can change effect. And, higher ed, as it's opening up to more and more people, we have to remember there will be more challenges and we have to find a way to tackle those challenges. So I think the biggest thing I'm trying to say is it's easy to get discouraged and it's easy to get burned out, especially because I feel like, we're always understaffed and we're overworking, but the work we do matters, and hopefully we can continue to make differences.
Yeah, thank you, Erin and Kate. I think those are amazing points to leave actionable items for our listeners and even for ourselves, right? To continue to learn. And I think I want to add to, it's okay to be vulnerable and ask questions, right? Like, I know that Erin, you mentioned this in the podcast where you led our conversations, where it's okay to make mistakes, but knowing that you still have to hold yourself accountable for those mistakes during your learning process and your personal journey of really trying to understand the barriers that students face, and students in perhaps populations that you yourself don't identify with, and how do we navigate those conversations can be very scary and difficult to do, but it's okay to have those conversations. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to make mistakes, because if we make mistakes while having conversations and during our learning process, that's how we learn. That's how we know, what inclusive language we should be using. How do we become an ally while also not shadowing the voices of those who do identify in groups that we're trying to highlight their voices. So it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to be vulnerable and be able to continue to learn about these student populations and to do research, and it's all okay. This is a huge undertaking for one person to dismantle all of the craziness that is the bureaucracy of higher ed, and you just got to take baby steps. And if you can help one student, you're making an effective and perhaps life-changing change for that student, for lack of a better word. I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Transformational.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you. A transformational change for that student. So I think we learned a lot on this podcast. We dived into student populations that are incredibly invisible, and we're hoping to bring them out of the shadows and highlight their experiences and their barriers, and be able to share those experiences with our listeners. Again, I would like to thank all of our listeners for tuning in. Is there any last remarks for my co-host?
I suppose I would just say diversity is a beautiful thing, and we are all different in many ways, and we can all learn from one another while also being kind and patient with one another.
And I would say, to tag on to that, we are all contributors to knowledge, like Yazmin said, and like Erin said. If there isn't something out there that answers your question, it may be something that should be looked into, and maybe you want to take the lead on that. There's no piece of knowledge that I think will go unappreciated. And so I think we all have the opportunity to always keep questioning and looking for ways to do better.
Thank you all for listening. As we've mentioned, we will have all of our resources that we've used and talked about on our podcast on our website. So please head over to our website if you all want to take a deeper dive into scholarship and really start doing those actual items that we talked about to be a scholarly practitioner. Again, thank you for listening to our podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to In the Shadows, a higher education podcast. We are your hosts, Yazmin, Erin, and Kate. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and will join us for future episodes. Clear Day, royalty-free music, is provided by Bensound. Visit them at www.bensound.com. Please visit our website at intheshadowspodcast.weebly.com to review the literature and resources discussed on today's episode. Please share any feedback or ask questions by emailing us at intheshadowsinfo@gmail.com.